Hello, everybody. Today we're talking about this study by Hassett et al., which is about sex differences in rhesus monkeys' toy preferences paralleling those of children. Now, when something is a parallel, it's like right next to each other, right? Not the same, but in the same line. So basically, Hassett and all were trying to study how sex differences in monkeys are the same and yet different from those of children. Sorry, I'm trying to get used to the camera also a little bit. Anyway, so the first thing I want to tell you, and I understand that a lot of you are not from a research background, and that's okay. So whenever you see this, ETAL, et al. Always is used when you have more than two authors of a research study. Then you use et al. You don't name all the authors. And this year in brackets is very simply the year of publication. So this study was published in 2008, which makes it a little bit old, but it's a very interesting study. And first, in this lesson, we are going to talk about the psychology that Hassett and her colleagues were attempting to study. Now, before we get into what they were trying to investigate, I want to give you a very quick overview of the study itself. So, if you think about this, what are the toys that you played with as a child, right? What were you interested in playing? What made you like some toys more than others? And why do you think you chose those toys, right? So if I think about it and I think about my nieces or my nephews and what I've seen them playing with, it's been a combination of building blocks or musical instruments or jigsaw puzzles, even stuffed toys or plush toys. And it's really interesting to think about where those preferences or those likings for certain things over the others have come from. And when you try to figure it out, you will find that you won't be able to tell whether some of your preferences or likings have come from your biology, meaning you were born with those particular inclinations, or if you like certain things simply because you were taught to like them. Now, Hassett and his colleagues were basically trying to figure out whether toy preferences in children come from our human biology or if they are socialized into us, meaning that we learn to like certain toys more than others if we are girls and certain toys more than others if we are boys, simply because we are born as boys or girls. So are they biological or sociological? And so the background research, which we will talk about as well, has shown that there is a biological component where something called prenatal hormones get involved. Whenever we use the word prenatal, we're talking about pre-birth, okay? So the prenatal stage is before a baby is born, and that is the point at which a baby is called a fetus. So I'm just going to explain some of these terminologies so that it does not get too overwhelming. And hormones are chemical messengers or chemicals that are released in our bodies, and we'll talk about this as well in a little more detail later. But you should know that prenatal hormones are basically the chemicals that are released for the fetus before it is born, and some studies that were done before show that there is very much a component of biology in the way that the preferences that we acquire as we grow older are shaped. Now, Hassett and all wanted to study this more, and they were focused very much on toy preferences. Now, they used plush toys and wheeled toys because they felt that these reflect activities that are preferred by boys and girls respectively, and they also thought that previous research, which was done by Alexander and Heinz, did not account for choice, right? So when you choose to do something, you are making a decision to go with option A as opposed to option B. you think about this, right? And the previous research that was done did not account for the role of choice. Hence, they wanted to see whether preference or choice can actually be measured and whether that preference or choice can be traced back to our biology. But they did not conduct this experiment on human children, and instead of that, they used rhesus monkeys. And actually, this very adorable monkey was part of the original study, and this toy that you can see right here was also part of that study. It was one of the wheeled toys that Hassett and her team used. So now that you understand a little bit of the context, which will help you sort of figure out why there was certain psychology that they were trying to investigate, let's talk about the actual psychology that this study was investigating. So, have you ever thought about what you have learned simply from the games that you have played? Sorry, I'm going to pause for a second, just right here. Arham, I'm not sure if the voice is lagging for you only, but if anybody else who's with me in class right now can please just write in the Q&A box whether the voice is lagging for you or not, please. That will help if it's a tech problem on our end. Okay, thank you, Javisha. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Aram, I think the voice is only lagging for you. I'm sorry. It might be a problem with your internet. But perhaps you can exit and, rejoin the call. Okay, let's get back to it. So what I was asking you earlier is, have you thought about why human beings engage in games, why we play, even as adults, right? You might play board games right now, you might play sports, you might like Catan, or you might play Monopoly, or you might play Scrabble, Pictionary. There are so many board games and there are so many sports that even as human adults we engage in. But when we were children, all of the games that we played, even the ones that we made up, right? The reason human beings play is because play has something that is called adaptive value. The skills that we learn through play actually help us to survive in this world. What does that mean? It means, for example, when you played with building blocks as a child, that helped you develop grip so that you can hold a pencil. When you played with jigsaw puzzles, it helped you understand how to solve problems. When you were playing with your brother, your sister, your cousins, or your friends, what we call rough and tumble play. And this is an expression that will come up again, so you should know what it means. Rough and tumble play is basically, the kind of wrestling that you kind of do when you're a little kid. Rough and tumble play actually helps us to understand how to behave with each other in groups. It makes us what we call more pro-social. Pro-social means more collective, being able to help each other, being able to coexist. And these are just some examples of how play has adaptive value and we learn through play, which is why then toy preferences, which are a way of playing, become very important. Because when we are playing, we are not just learning skills, we're also expressing ourselves, we're expressing who we are, we're telling the world what kind of person we are. And that is true even of us as children. Play is what helps us to regulate our emotions. It helps us to put ourselves forward as the person that we really hold in our mind that we are. So for example, think about an imaginary game that you played and what were the characters that you would like to play in those, little plays that maybe you did skits with your family and your friends, maybe with your siblings, and all of that combined really was your way of telling the world who you are. So play is very, very important, but human beings are not the only species that we see play in, right? Animals will also play with each other. I have a cat and I have a dog. They don't play with each other, but when they're playing on their own, they're just having fun. The difference between human and animal play is simply that human beings play for self-expression, for identity, and for skill building, but in animals, play is a way of sort of expressing or getting rid of pent-up energy. Now, Hassett et al., again, because they were looking at toy preferences, were deeply interested in play as well. So that was one of the pieces of the background psychology that they were trying to investigate. Now, next we'll talk about what else they were looking at. Now, when we are born, we have what is called our biological sex. Biological sex is assigned at birth, whether you are a boy or a girl. And your chromosomes are what determine your sex at birth, whether you're going to be a boy or a girl. So XX chromosomes will result in a female baby. XY chromosomes will result in a male baby. And chromosomes reside in your DNA. And you probably already know that each human being has unique DNA, right? And DNA is essentially this sort of helix, and I have a drawing of it later on, but it sort of looks a little bit like the figure 8. And this is, sorry, my drawing of what DNA looks like. But basically, your DNA is what provides the information to the rest of your body on what sort of proteins are going to be released, how is your body going to develop, what kind of muscle growth will you experience. All of that is coded into your DNA. So is your biological sex through your chromosomes, which are part of this double helix that we call the DNA structure. Now, chromosomes are important to Hassett et al. As well because they determine hormone levels. Now, hormones, I had mentioned earlier as well, are basically chemicals, and they are produced by glands inside your body. And those hormone levels will impact a lot of things. As adults, hormones will impact how we feel. Hormones will impact certain growth. You grow taller, for example, because of a growth hormone, or you may not grow as tall because of the level of growth hormone in your body. But when you are a fetus, before you are born, there are still hormones that are released in the mother's body, which then shape the development of the fetus as well, right? So first of all, nature produces sex differences. Why? Because chromosomes, which are very biological and are encoded in your DNA, will then determine the levels of hormones that are released in the mother's bloodstream for the baby's development. And those hormone levels will also impact the brain development of the fetus. Now, what does that mean? It means that two pieces of brain development that you should know about. The first one is called neural connections, and the second one is about new cells. So let's first talk about synaptogenesis. So synaptogenesis is about new connections being formed between different parts of your brain. If you're wondering what neural means, don't worry. Neural comes from the word neuron, and neurons are the technical term for basically brain cells. And all the cells, all the neurons in our brain are connected to each other. Every time we learn something new, we are forming a new neural connection. Every time we forget something and have completely stopped using it, or using that particular piece of information, that neural connection may die. But right now, when you're just about to be born, it's all about neural connections starting to form, about neurogenesis, which is basically new neurons being born in your brain. And it's really important for you to take away from this that Hassett et al. Were aware that hormone levels impact the development of the brain, because hormone levels will affect the kinds of neural connections that are made, and they will also affect the kind of new cells or what neurogenesis happens. So, based on that, Hassett and her colleagues were trying to figure out all of these behavioral differences that we see in children based on the kinds of toys they prefer. Do they come from their biological sex? But that's not all, because there's a little more. Nurture, which refers to the world around us and not to our biology, is what is held responsible for gender differences. As you can see, gender comes from culture. Culture is your norms and your values, and basically the ways in which you are supposed to behave comes from the culture that surrounds you. Now, the ways in which you're supposed to behave informs the socialization of a child. And what does socialization mean? Socialization is how the adults around you teach you to interact with the world around you based on what society expects, right? Or what society thinks is the acceptable and appropriate ways to behave. Particularly with reference to Hassett et al., it's about how society expects a boy child and a girl child to behave. And those come from what we call stereotypes. What are masculine stereotypes and what are feminine stereotypes? A stereotype is essentially a general notion or a generalized idea which is held to be true. Hence, it's a generalized belief about what certain groups of people or animals or objects represent, right? So, black cats bring bad luck. That's a stereotype, right? In the same way, boys don't cry is a stereotype for what masculine behavior should not be. Girls like to cook is a stereotype for what feminine behavior should be like, right? And so gender and biological sex are not the same thing, because while biology determines whether you're born as a boy or a girl, gender or nurture is what determines how you understand how to be a boy or how to be a girl. Now, as you can see, there are two very different perspectives right now. And Hassett and her colleagues were trying to figure out, well, is it socialization? Is it biology? Right? And so the psychology that they were investigating was the psychology of play, because if play is what helps us evolve and helps us adapt and survive in this world, then does biology determine how we play? Because that would make sense. But then we think about culture and we think about socialization, and then we realize, well, we can't say with certainty whether it is actually just biology, because we cannot ignore the role that the world around us plays in shaping our preferences and shaping who we become. So I hope you're with me so far, because it gets a little bit more complex as we go on. And now we'll talk directly about Hassett and their study. Basically, for Hassett and her colleagues, sex hormones, which are, for example, you call androgens, and you will come across androgens again. A common androgen is testosterone, and you have probably heard of testosterone before. It's a male sex hormone. And for Hassett and her colleagues, they realized, well, okay, sex hormones like androgens will affect brain development. When brain development is affected, remember, new neural connections and new neurons, which means that sex hormones will actually impact our cognitive abilities, which are our ways of thinking. How do we think? What are the mental processes that come into play? What do we remember? What do we pay attention to? How much attention do we pay to what, etc., etc.? And then those cognitive abilities of thinking, remembering, feeling, all of those things, problem solving, those then are related to the kinds of activities we prefer. Now, the reason we're talking about activity preferences is because the underlying sort of idea is that the kinds of toys that we played with as children, which is why I asked you earlier on, what kinds of toys did you play with as a child? Because those reflect the kinds of activities that you prefer to do. So if you prefer to think about problems and sort of calculate things in your mind, then it's very likely that you might be drawn more towards a problem solving toy like a jigsaw puzzle. But if you are somebody who prefers to work with your hands, then you might be drawn to a toy like a Lego, or some sort of, construction game or something like that. Or if you're somebody who prefers to be more creative in your activities, then you will be drawn to toys like, those little painting books or coloring books and so on and so forth. So your cognitive abilities shape your activity preferences, and Hassett et al. Refer to this as the activity bias. And that activity bias then is related to toy preferences. But you see, they still couldn't figure out why there are certain toys that are more strongly preferred by boys and certain toys that are more strongly preferred by girls. And they were trying to figure that out because it's important to know whether the kinds of toys that children play with actually are determined by their biology, or whether the kinds of toys children play with, those pink and blue aisles that you see in toy stores, where all the pink aisles are full of Barbies and kitchen sets for girls, and all the blue aisles are full of Legos and cars and trucks for boys. Do those come from our society, or are they literally representing a biological basis for gender differences? So it's a very important study. And as we move forward into this next part, we will now start talking about the background, we'll start talking about the background of this study, which means that I'm going to tell you more about the research that shaped Hassett et al.'s belief that yes, there is certainly a role that sex hormones play, and that activity bias is a real thing.